What up, PLO Order? Welcome to the new video. Today we're going to talk about how to play paired boards on flop versus 3-bets. And it means versus 3-better pre-flop. So we open, someone 3-bets, flop comes paired. What is our strategy? And let's get started. This time we do something different because I chose to open PLO Vision. And instead of PowerPoint slides, let's use the PLO Vision and check some different scenarios, in position, out of position, and hopefully you can pick up some tendencies and strategies, how to approach paired boards. And this is solver strategy. In the end, we can discuss, should we follow solver strategy? What if opponent doesn't follow solver strategy? But let's start with the GTO approach. And first board is Queen Queen Deuce Rainbow. Suited. And there's two Broadway cards. We are on the cutoff, and button has 3-bet us. And we can see that on these paired boards we don't really need only 12%, and most hands that we would need here for 1/3 are suited aces, maybe some trips, full houses, depending whether we block the hearts or not. But in general, we check these boards most of the time. And then the 3-better is going to stab with 1/3 size in half of the time. And he's going to do that with pretty wide range. If we give him range of aces, then half of his aces would bet, and most of the aces are with mixed strategy. There are some aces that are mostly c-bet all the time, like aces without the nut flush draw. If there's aces with the nut flush draw, it's more mixed. There's some checks behind. But in general, stabbing half of the time. If the 3-better happens to have a queen, then he is going to stab 2 out of 3 times. So still decent amount of checks to protect his checking range. But when he does stab for 1/3, then the interesting numbers here are that we're going to defend over 50% of times, 54%. We're going to call 1 out of 3 times, and we're going to raise 19%. And if we do have a trips, it's pretty much 50-50 whether we do or not raise. But then if we have an ace of hearts, we raise that pretty much always, especially if we have backdoor flush draw. If we have just a naked ace of hearts, the interesting part is, you can see here, that we're going to call 60% of times. And that's for later bluffing. I would say, if you want to make things simplified, because even just the naked ace of hearts is being raised 40% of times, you can pretty much raise when you have the ace of hearts here. With the nut flush draw, there's still 50-50 almost raising. So a lot of the hands that we raise do have the ace of hearts. And when we do have the nut flush draw, 40% of times we raise. And then it's more based on how many hearts we have. If we have just the hearts draw, we have ace in the hand and we have a heart draw, it's just a call. And in general, if we have heart draw, it's still raised 30% of times. And I would say that this is probably one area where people don't raise often enough. And when we raise half of the pot, it means that we are raising 60 to win 68. So it has to work slightly less than half of the time. So in general, I would say that often when people have just the flush draw, they're going to call. But if you raise, when you have the hearts, it's less likely that the pre-flop tree better has heart draw, if you have the ace of hearts, or ace of heart blocker, king of heart blocker, then you can be very aggressive on this board. But the general idea is when opponent bets small, then it opens up the raise that has pretty good numbers for the bluffer if we raise with the bluff. I call it 50-50 raise. If we raise here, there's 68 on the pot. If we raise to 68, then we're risking 68 to win 68, which means that it has to work exactly 50% of times to become profitable. So when opponent bets small, it opens the door for us to raise with wider range, because it doesn't have to work often. If opponent phones half of his hands, it's good for us. Of course, when we move forward, when we raise with wide range, the preflop aggressor is going to defend 57, almost 60% of hands versus our raise. And I would say that people often just fold here unless they have a strong hand. And this is GTO approach, where the button 3-better bets everything he does with 33% sizing. We're going to talk in the end, is that actually the case, and how should we do it if we don't? Let's change the board. Let's make it rainbow and see if the numbers change. When the board is rainbow, pretty much our checking or donking strategy doesn't really change. We don't really donk. So we check most of our range. This guy bets close to 50-50, so kind of same strategy. But now we raise 24, so we raise a bit more. And then it's more about what kind of hands do we raise. And if we have a 1 queen, now it's raised 64% of times. On the flush draw board, remember that it was more 50-50. Now we raise a bit more often on the rainbow board. And let's see what happens if we have ace in our hand. With just an ace, we raise 30%. And most of the hands have 2 backdoor flush draws. So there's that additional playability. And reason why we want to raise some ace high hand is we block pocket aces, which is huge part of opponent's range that can continue. And then one hand that might cause problems is pocket kings. I'm not sure if it's folded, is that really small portion, but basically we're calling 85 and raising 14% of times. And the hands that we raise is mostly with 2 backdoor flush draws. So kings with 2 backdoor flush draws, raise. But other than that, call. If you call a 3-bet with kings, if you fold to the small bet, it's kind of waste of hand. Then don't call preflop if you put your opponent into aces. So that's very disconnected paired board. Then let's see if we have Queen 9-9. And let's first make it suited. So the pair is a bit lower, but now there's more connectivity. Jack 10 gives us the straight. Still very passive approach from ourselves, but now we can see that the 3-better starts to stab a lot more. Still same sizing, 33 on paired boards, but now Queen 9-9 gives the 3-better a bit more stronger range because he has a lot of Broadway rundowns, Jack 10, King Jack 10, and so on. So he's tapping way more often here. And once he stabs, pretty much we still continue with half of our hands. Now, one thing to remember here is if you don't fold as much to 3-bets as solver does, then you shouldn't continue with half of your hands post-flop. Because solver folds a lot of the crappy hands pre-flop. But in general, to the small bets, we shouldn't overfold. With pocket kings, continuing over 70% of times, just not giving up, and raising with flush draw and backdoor flush draw. Kings with hearts, mixed strategy, and so on. If we have just a queen, one or more, continue with a lot of times. If we have the flush draw, then continue 84% of times, so pretty much we don't fold flush draw. The hands that we do fold are here, and these are the really small and low flush draws. Oh, that's raise. Where's the folds? Here are the folds. Like, well, Jack 10 7 6 is a fold, which is super weird balancing kind of stuff because it has open ender and a flush draw. So remember that solver goes for balance, and then it sometimes might fold a hand similar that it might call or even raise sometimes, but as Jack 10 7 5 is a call, and then we had the Jack 10 7 6, which is a fold, which doesn't make sense in a way, because Jack 10 7 6 seems to be stronger than Jack 10 7 5. So remember, it depends how well the simulation was made, and even then it's not perfect. So don't get attached to the single hands if you use solver to practice spots or to improve your strategy. Like, don't think that okay, Jack 10 with flush draw has to be folded if you look at the one hand, because then here we have pretty much the same hand that is a call and sometimes even a raise. But solver does that with individual hands to have balance, and there might be some kind of those inconsistent strategies. But you should look at the overall strategy instead of individual hands. If we turn the same flop in the rainbow, does anything change? And what we saw from the previous hands, in general, we don't make huge adjustment to our strategy, it's just the preflop aggressor stabs a bit more. So we need slightly more, but pretty much not so much. And then it's 50-50 whether to stab or not. And once again, if he stabs, we defend around half of our hand. So on these boards, in 3-bet pots, if both players are playing solver strategy, then we are operating with pretty wide ranges. And that's when it becomes hard to play, because solver plays perfect, and solver's opponents plays perfect, so they don't make mistakes post-flop. But you, let's say we are on the cutoff, and we check, button bets, we call, and then the turn is 4 of diamonds. What should we do now? If we have pocket kings, what do we do? Are we calling 3 streets? Are we folding at some point? We check the whole range, and now 3-betters should barrel 70% of times. And we should continue with over 60% of our hands that we call the flop. And now comes the hard part, like, it's easy to memorize the flop strategies and general frequencies and just look at what kind of hands do we continue with. And we're happy, okay, we check on the flop standard, then comes a turn. And we're like, oh damn, what should we do? Or let's say we have pocket kings. And the turn is 10 of spades. And we have pocket kings. What should we do? And now it becomes harder. We should actually read out pretty much our whole range. But often people check. And there comes the bet. And we have pocket kings. We should raise 21% of times. Which is, if we have the flush that we decided to check. But if we check our whole kings, then making this strategy doesn't apply, because we have the wrong range here that solver thinks we should have. So the problem in solver strategy is that the more forward we're going to hand to turns rivers, the more complicated it is, and the harder it is to get to the turn or river with the same ranges that solver would have. And then if we just check out how would solver play this turn, we had overall frequencies, but our range is not the same that solver thinks we have. And that's when we might make big errors and mistakes. And like on these paired boards, when we operate with pretty wide ranges, both players continue with half of their hands versus some kind of aggression, which leads to some really marginal spots. Then to follow the strategy, follow it through to the turn and river is really hard. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't practice it. Yes, you definitely should. If you have a chance, you should see how solver plays, why it does so, how aggressive is he, and so on and so on. But at the same time, compare that strategy, adjust that strategy versus your actual opponent. Let's do one more to see if we have differences here in position. Let's keep the same button versus cutoff, but let's make the board smaller, and 8-3-3. Board that doesn't hit 3-better's range. Now we check 100%. And this is the funny thing. 8-3-3 rarely hits super strong 3-better's range, but it doesn't hit cutoff range. So cutoff checks everything, and 3-better bets everything. And then cutoff defends with 65% of hands. Which means that very often, if both players play solver strategy, button bets the flop, cutoff calls with most of his hands, and we enter the turn with super wide range. Button has his whole 3-betting range, and cutoff has 2/3 of his preflop range involved. And that's when things get tricky. Let's say we call, and what would be a nice turn? 2 of diamonds, totally blank. Cutoff checks whole range, and 3-better is very aggressive, even some potting. I would say that it pots with ace of heart blocker and spades. Now solver is using these suits to make a difference in balancing the ranges. But very aggressive barreling. And I'm quite sure that in reality, most players, if they stab the flop opponent calls, then on the turn they check back to realize their equity. I cannot see people barreling 80% of times on this board. What happens if we are in position? And let's use the one queen deuce that we had before. Now we are the button. The 3-better has 3-bet us from the small blind. Now we can see that he stabs still super wide on these paired boards. And we call with 60% of hands. So the ranges don't really change that much. We raise 16%, probably the same kind of range that we would need on the previous hand, but still operating with super wide ranges. And 60% is a lot of hands. If we call here with overpairs, queen, and flush draws, that's going to be around 30% of hands, even less. So we call a 3-bet, we don't have that many overpairs. We don't have aces, we fold a decent amount of kings, maybe. So once again, reality is way different than solver. If we make it rainbow, the 3-better still stabs very often, and we defend quite often. If the 3-better checks, you can see that we don't go bananas, because very often this check, at least for solver, it's half of the time check fold, or not half of the time. Some of the time is check fold, some of the time check call, some of the time check raise. But there's pretty much the same amount of raising hands as folding hands. So we don't attack. We don't see that, okay, he checked the flop, he doesn't have nothing. But in reality, very often when he checks, he has aces or kings, and he's pot controlling. So we don't go bananas. We just check behind. And once it goes check, check, now preflop aggressor starts to bet in because he has a huge range advantage. So in paired boards, even the connected ones, in solver strategy, we always use 33% sizing. And because the sizing is so small, then the other player is going to defend with pretty wide range. Now, in real life, especially in small stakes, I would say that there aren't many players that would, let's say the board is, let's say it's queen 199 suited. On this board, I would say that there aren't many players who would stab 33% with their whole range. There are some, I know for sure. There are some players, but most players have different sizing. Most players wouldn't bet 96% of times. If they have a hand like ace, jack, 7-7 without the hard draw, they often just might give up. Pocket aces would check here very often if they don't have the hearts. And then what I have seen is a lot of regulars use 33 with hand like naked aces, bluffs, and so on. If they would have a 9, like ace 9, or they have aces with flush draw, they use bigger sizing. So very often the small sizing on 3-bet boards, on flop, c-bets on their boards, is weighted towards the bottom of their range. And then when they have a really strong hand, they bet bigger because they want to build up the pot. So the important thing is when you play, and let's say opponent 3-bets you, this is the board, and then opponent bets 1/3. If the hand goes to showdown, check what he had. And you might even want to make a note. Because if you can see that, okay, his 1/3 sizing is often bet fold sizing, and then when he's happy to get the stacks in, he bets half a pot, 2/3, or even more, or even pot, then you can really outplay them by making these raises. We raise, there's 64 in the pot. If we raise to 64, we need to make him fold half the time, which he's going to do if his small sizing is weighted towards the bottom of his range. Another thing, in 3-bet pots, there aren't many players in small stakes who raise as a bluff. when people raise you on 3-bet boards, especially in these paired boards, it's weighted heavily towards the top of their range. Of course, we shouldn't raise here, but 12% of times in general. But let's make it queen, queen, deuce, rainbow. Now we raise 16% of times, which is a bit more. But when people raise, they don't really have a lot of bluffs in their range. The bottom of their range is not flush draw. But very often they have the queen. Even with not flush draw, most people are happy to just call because the price is so cheap. So once again, when we use Vision or Solver to see what would be the GTO approach versus a raise, and we see that, okay, we should call the raise 60% of times. The thing is, you have to ask yourself, is my opponent raising with solver range? Or is he raising more value heavy? Because if we would change the simulation so that button only raises queen flush or not flush draw, then the defending frequencies would change. Because now solver assumes that button raises with the strategy that is set here in the parameters. So it's always important when you work with solver to compare it to the actual real life and see if my opponent raises, don't think that, okay, I should use these strategies because it's GTO. No, you should use these strategies if opponent is raising GTO frequencies and ranges. But if he's raising only queen plus, it would be insane to defend 60% of hands. We should fold pretty much everything without the queen ourselves if we know that opponent is raising only for value. And what I have seen in small stakes, let's say PLO 50 and lower, most players, I would say that average player is very honest in 3-bet pots. Of course, stacks get in with wide ranges. People stack off lightly. But you don't see pure bluffs in 3-bet pots often. There are players who can do it. I've seen some insane bluffs in 3-bet pots, even multi-way situations. But it doesn't happen that often. I would say that 90% of times people play very honestly, very straightforward. And what that means, it opens the door for you to step one step higher and exploit people being face up. And one way, or one of the easiest ways and situations, is monotone and paired boards where people use small sizing. And I kind of thank solvers for doing that, because earlier people used bigger sizings and then fighting against that, the risk went up. If opponent bets half a pot and we make decent size raise, we are risking a lot more. The numbers don't favor us, but versus small bets, we can make really profitable bluffs. And as in general, people are overfolding. So we can be way more aggressive than solver is, because people are not defending. If someone bets small and we raise queen, queen, deuce with hearts, he's not defending that amount of times. No, we can't select. Just what would we do if we don't have the ace of hearts in our hand? So, you can try. I love 3-bet pots versus neat and weak regulars who have just watched solver videos. They watch Chain and his videos and okay, on 3-bet pots, paired boards, we should use small sizing. Alright, let's do that. But then they use the small sizing only with the bottom of their range. And when they actually crush the boards, they bet bigger. So then I love to see how they react to raise. And if I raise and they just snap fold, then I make a note that, okay, folded after small bet. Then if I see them do that a couple of times more, it tells me that, okay, he's most likely overfolding. And we can just exploit him, and he is wondering, how can that guy hit every flop? And then when he actually fights back, if we actually have a hand, we get a huge implied odds. So if you want to exploit your opponents, you have to monitor what they're doing. You have to make notes. You have to be aware what's going on. And these paired boards are kind of monotone boards. They are special occasions. Because if the board is not monotone, not paired, then there's a lot of different dynamic structures. And it's harder to pick up the frequencies or the strategies. But let's say on monotone boards, if we always bet half a pot, then the opponent probably, if he's a decent one, he will see that, okay, he always bets half a pot. And then he might adjust or might not. Paired boards, if we always raise, at some point he's going to figure out that, okay, he's raising a lot of paired boards. And then he might adjust or he might not. He might adjust in a good way or in a bad way. So if opponent bets small on these boards and you raise and he folds, then don't assume that you can keep doing that for the rest of your life. Pay attention, because at some point he might start to adjust. And then you need to readjust. If he starts to call with wider range, so a couple of times he folds, and then he calls your raise with pocket jacks, jack, 10, 9 type of hand, then you might make a note that, okay, he's probably aware that I'm raising often. He adjusts by widening his calling range. Maybe we should go for either barreling more or value heavy raising range. Or we see that opponent shoves naked aces without any hearts, without backdoors, and we have the queen. We see that, okay, he's overplaying aces now. So pay attention what the opponent is doing. And one of the hard things, as I said before, when practicing these kind of situations with vision or solver, the problem compared to real life is that no one enters the turn with same ranges as solver does on small stakes. Or from the turn to the river. So then when you're practicing and seeing that, okay, on the flop we should do this one, okay, we call the raise, turn is 8 of diamonds. How should we play here? Okay, we should check our whole range, that is easy barn. Button bets, half a pot, okay, we should call 60% of the, raise 60% of times. With a range that is already super wide. So we should probably get it in with a lot wider range than we're comfortable. And it's based on the assumption that button operates with super wide range here. But in reality, if his flop range is very value heavy and his turn barreling range is 90% of value, and we decide to just get it in with a lot of hands because solver says so, we're doing huge mistakes. So to be a good player, you need to understand what solver strategy tells you and when you can use it, when you shouldn't use it. When to take the solver strategies, tendencies, frequencies, and when to understand that opponent is so far from solver strategy that we should not follow solver strategy ourselves because it leads to huge mistakes. And paired boards are a very good example of that. So instead of picking up perfect strategies for paired boards, if you were looking for that, pretty much the whole message in the video is that we can be a bit more aggressive than solver, and we should stab paired boards as a 3-better very often and use 1/3 sizing. Now, I would say that unless you're exploiting opponent with different sizings, then use 1/3 with your whole range. Don't start to do that 1/3 when we are bluffing and 50% or more when we value betting. because then someone like me might pick it up and just exploit you. So Solver operates with really wide ranges from both sides. And if your opponent is playing like Solver, you might actually label him as a good customer, because there's a lot of pretty weak hands that we should continue with, especially in position. So make a note that in Solver strategy, you should play with pretty wide ranges, and then just have a perfect balance on the turns and rivers, which is very hard in real life. But paired boards are like monotone boards. They offer a really good spot for better player to exploit the worst player. And those are the situations when you increase your win rate. When you flop nut flush versus second nut flush, that's not increasing your win rate, that's just variance. But when you strategically beat the shit out of your opponent, hand after hand after hand after hand, that's when you generate win rate. So make notes, pay attention, see what your opponent does, and exploit him. Alright, hope you enjoyed. I will see you on the next video. This was paired boards in 3-bet pots. Thanks and bye bye.